let's talk about something we're all seeing every single day, the incredible polarization in our politics. To really get to the bottom of it, we're going to use a tool that's, believe it or not, over 100 years old.
So let's start with this puzzle. Have you ever just stopped and noticed how groups on the far left and the far right, people with totally opposite goals, often act in ways that are, well, eerily similar? You see the same kind of anger, that same absolute certainty, that same us versus them mindset. It's one of the biggest paradoxes of our time, and today, we're going to pull it apart.
So here's our game plan. We'll start with a powerful insight from the past. Then we'll break down the 6 psychological rules that govern these big movements. After that, we'll define the extremes we see today. And then we'll apply these rules to real-world examples from both the right and the left. And finally, we'll wrap up by asking a really tough question. How do we find our way back to reason? Our guide on this whole journey is going to be a French thinker named Gustave Le Bon and his incredible book, The Psychology of Revolution. Now, this thing was written over a century ago, but honestly, it feels like it was written yesterday. It's like a surgical knife for cutting through all the noise and fanaticism we see on our feeds.
Okay, so Le Bon gave us this amazing framework for understanding how these mass movements work. Let's dive right into the 6 core principles that are going to be our analytical toolkit for today.
So, Le Bon pinpointed 6 key dynamics. First, and this is huge, in a crowd, group emotion completely steamrolls individual reason. Second, these movements start to act just like a religion, demanding total, unquestioning faith. Third, for an idea to really take off, it has to stop being an idea and become an intense emotional belief. Fourth, the fancy goals they talk about often just mask a raw struggle for power. Fifth, when you're in a crowd, you lose your sense of personal responsibility. And finally, gut feelings and emotional logic take over, completely shoving rational thought out of the way. Keep these 6 things in mind, because we're about to see them everywhere.
All right, so now that we have our toolkit from Le Bon, let's get really clear on the 2 groups we're looking at. We need to define what the far left and far right actually say they want, especially when it comes to the big social issues.
So on one side, you have the far left. Here the keyword is equality. That means pushing hard for racial equality, welcoming immigration and multiculturalism, and really championing feminism and LGBTQ+ rights to get rid of gender inequality. Then you've got the far right. For them, the keyword is identity. This usually means a focus on national purity, a desire for cultural sameness, which often leads to opposing immigration. It also means protecting traditional family structures and gender roles. So on paper, they're polar opposites, right? But what about under the hood? Psychologically? Well, that's what we're about to find out. All right, time to put this theory to the test. Let's start by using Le Bon's psychological lens to examine 3 real-world examples from the far right. First up, the America First movement. Think about this. A story pushed by a charismatic leader, specifically about a stolen election. For a huge number of people, this didn't just stay a political claim. It morphed into something much deeper, an absolute, unshakable belief. And this takes us straight to Le Bon's concept of the loss of responsibility. See, when you're one face in a massive crowd, you feel anonymous. You feel like you can't be held accountable. This little psychological switch helps explain how people who are normally law-abiding citizens could end up participating in something like the 2021 Capitol riot. It's like their individual conscience just dissolved into the collective energy of the group.
Okay, let's head over to Europe now and look at Italy's Brothers of Italy Party. Their whole strategy is like a masterclass in Le Bon's psychology. They take these incredibly complex problems, like the economy or social change, and they boil them down into simple, supercharged emotional slogans against things like illegal immigration or threats to the traditional family.
And that right there is a perfect example of what Le Bon called emotional logic. The whole point isn't to win a rational debate with facts and figures. Nope. The goal is to bypass reason entirely and appeal directly to the crowd's gut feelings, to their deepest fears, their sense of who they are. And just like that, politics stops being a discussion and starts being a war of emotions. For our third case on the right, we'll stay in France with the National Rally Party. What they've done so well is take a pretty abstract idea, protecting French culture, and transform it into something almost sacred for their followers. It's not just a political stance anymore. It's a belief system that you simply do not question. And this is a brilliant illustration of Le Bon's point, that a political movement can basically function like a religion. I mean, think about it. It has all the pieces. There's a simple creed,
protect the culture. You have passionate, devoted followers. And, maybe most importantly, you have a clearly defined enemy, a heretic. In this case, immigrants and minorities are cast as the threat to the purity of the faith.
Okay, so we've seen how Le Bon's ideas apply to the right. But now for the real test. Do these exact same psychological patterns show up on the far left? Let's turn our lens to the other side of the spectrum and see what happens. So let's consider some of the protests connected to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's really important to state that the movement's cause, the fight against racial discrimination, comes from a place of justice and reason. But in some specific instances, the psychology of the crowd took over, and that collective anger boiled over into acts of looting and arson. And this is a powerful example of what Le Bon called crowd de-intellectualization. It's basically when the group's emotions short-circuit an individual's reasoning. In that intense, superheated moment, a person's own moral compass and their sense of legal boundaries can just go offline. Impulsive, even destructive behavior can erupt from the group, and it just goes to show that no movement, no matter how righteous its goals, is immune to these psychological traps.
For our second case, let's jump back in time to France, to the massive student and worker uprisings of May 1968. This was a true cultural earthquake, and its main goal was incredibly ambitious: to challenge every single kind of authority out there.
The entire spirit of the movement can be summed up in this one incredible slogan. It is forbidden to forbid. This became their absolute mantra. And because of this, really important causes like the push for gender and racial equality got pushed to a fanatical extreme. The goal was no longer reform, it was the total destruction of all traditions and all systems of order, both old and new.
And this is a perfect example of a thought transformed into belief. A very complex, philosophical critique of authority gets simplified by the crowd into an absolute, non-rational dogma. It becomes a belief that rejects any kind of disagreement and aims for nothing less than total revolution. It's fueled entirely by that uncompromising collective will.
And for our final case on the left, let's look at the calls from some radical groups to deconstruct the family. This idea starts off in academia, as a pretty complex critique of the traditional family as a patriarchal institution. But once it gets adopted by certain radical groups, it gets simplified into an emotionally charged slogan that demands one thing: its total abolition.
So, after looking at both political extremes through this century-old lens, a really startling picture starts to emerge, doesn't it? We see the exact same psychological machinery at work on completely opposite sides. And that brings us to a final, and I think very crucial reflection on where we are today. We've seen how both the far right and the far left can be hijacked by this powerful, collective, emotional engine that just runs right over individual reason. So that leaves us with a really big question. Standing here, between these two fanatical poles, where do we go?
Le Bon's work doesn't just diagnose the sickness, it actually points towards the cure. The way forward isn't to pick a team and join the shouting. It seems to be about finding that middle path, one that's grounded in scientific evidence and rational conversation. But here's the thing, that's the hard road. It's not easy. As this quote says, rationally accepting reality requires courage. In an age that runs on emotion and outrage, maybe the most courageous thing any of us can do is to simply choose reason, to see the world as it is. And defending that, well, that might be the most important challenge we all face.